All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we've got
An interesting pairing.
yeah, and I really enjoy the pairings that you come up with because they really do make me think in ways that I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, I hope so.
So today we have excerpts from Richard Wagner's autobiography, My Life, Volume 1, and we're
Yeah.
going to be looking at that
Okay.
alongside some concepts from the Law of One material.
Interesting.
So, what do you think about this pairing? What jumps out at you right away?
Well, I mean, on the surface, they seem very different, right?
Right.
Wagner, the huge figure in music, talking about his development as an artist and as a person,
Right.
and then the law of one, this cosmology, this system for thinking about consciousness and reality.
Right, and it's interesting that Wagner's really exploring this kind of intense personal world of artistic creation and relationships and all the messiness of life.
Yeah.
And then we have Raw through the Law of One offering this really big picture view of like the universe and our place in it.
That's right.
So I'm really curious to see where this goes today.
Yeah, me too. And hopefully some interesting connections will emerge, some interesting contrasts and some food for thought for our listeners.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of explore each of these perspectives
Right.
and then see what happens when we bring them together.
Okay, sounds good.
Do they resonate? Do they clash? Are there unexpected echoes?
Mhm.
Or are they totally on different wavelengths?
Right.
So let's start with Wagner,
Okay.
and specifically his early life, as he describes it in My Life.
Right.
What really struck you about his early relationship with music?
I think what really stood out to me was just the depth of his emotional connection to music
Yeah.
from a very young age.
Yeah, and he describes it in such a visceral way.
Right.
Right at the beginning, he talks about this strange anguish that he felt when he heard about Beethoven stuff.
Okay.
And he links it back to his earlier grief over the passing of Weber, the composer Weber, and even to this childhood fear of certain sounds on the violin.
Interesting.
So it's like music wasn't just something he listened to, passively.
Right.
It was this deeply felt experience for him.
It seems like it, yeah.
And it's interesting how these really intense emotional responses kind of fueled his artistic drive.
Yeah. I noticed that too. He mentions the indescribable effect of hearing Beethoven's symphony in a major.
Wow.
Imagine that kind of impact on a young mind.
Yeah, I mean that's huge.
It wasn't just enjoyment, it was like a catalyst.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the music itself, right? He was
Right.
also really captivated by the idea of Beethoven, the deaf genius.
The persona.
Yeah, the persona
Yeah.
as depicted in those lithographs he talks about.
It's almost like the legend itself amplified the power of the music.
Totally. So, his school years seem to have been a bit more challenging.
Oh, yeah, that's one way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He gets dismissed from St. Nicholas's School for being too deeply in disgrace, whatever that means.
Sounds like a handful.
Yeah. Maybe a bit of a rebel.
Right.
I-
But I'm curious about where he went from there.
Yeah, so he ends up doing some private study.
Okay.
And there was this plan for him to go to St. Thomas's School.
All right.
And then his uncle Adolf gets involved and starts encouraging him to study science.
Interesting. In a different path.
Yeah, and there's this really funny little anecdote about Wagner trying to learn Greek,
Okay.
using Sophocles, no less.
Ambitious.
But he's driven away by the smell of a nearby tanyard.
Oh, no.
I mean, you can practically smell it, right?
I can imagine.
It's just such a vivid sensory detail.
It is. And it kind of highlights how even these, seemingly minor external factors could really influence his interest.
Right, it wasn't all grand inspiration.
Right. Exactly.
Sometimes it was just a bad smell.
Yeah.
So, but then there's this work that he does proofreading for Becker's Universal History.
Okay.
And this seems to have been a real turning point for him intellectually.
In what way?
Well, he was getting paid 8 pence a sheet, which, maybe wasn't a fortune, but it was something.
Sure.
But more importantly, he talks about how he gained this real historical knowledge
Okay.
going way beyond the superficial stuff that he had learned in school.
Interesting.
And he becomes fascinated by the Middle Ages and the French Revolution,
Wow.
which is kind of setting the stage for some of his later work.
Yeah. I can see that.
But what's really interesting is his reaction to the heroes of the French Revolution.
What about it?
He talks about this sincere hatred that he felt for their cruelty,
Wow.
and he emphasizes that this was a purely human emotional response
Okay.
that stayed with him even as he later tried to grapple with the political significance of their actions.
So you have this tension between his feelings and his intellectual understanding of history.
Exactly.
After,
So let's move on to his student days in Leipzig.
okay.
The student culture that he describes sounds kind of wild,
Yeah.
like almost larger than life. Well, he talks about the unheard of splendor of students guarding the gates of the city.
Okay.
And it attracted this rowdy bunch from all these different universities, Halle Göttingen.
It sounds like a party atmosphere.
Yeah, it must have been pretty intense.
And he was right in the thick of it.
Oh, yeah. He says he never missed a day on guard or a night either.
Wow. Fully immersed.
Yeah, it sounds like he wanted to experience it all.
And he makes this interesting observation that the more studious students kind of dropped out of this whole guard duty thing,
Right.
while he and his friends, who he describes as this extraordinarily desperate and dissipated type, remained.
Yeah, and it sounds like those times really forged some strong bonds between them.
Yeah, I mean, they were these champions of a certain lifestyle,
Right.
and they kind of found a home in Leipzig because of the circumstances there.
Exactly. So then he takes this trip to Prague,
Right.
which he kind of frames as this bohemian excursion. And it's interesting because it seems like he goes there with a bit of a chip on his shoulder.
In what way?
Well, he talks about returning with a friend and hoping to recreate these profound impressions they had from the past.
Okay.
But there's also this sense of maybe some youthful arrogance, even a desire to maybe settle some old scores with some people.
Interesting. So how does that play out?
Well, he meets up with these women who he refers to as his former fair friends.
Oh, yeah.
But their family situation has changed.
How so?
The count who they were associated with, Count Pochta, had died.
Okay.
And so things are different for them now.
And how does he act towards them?
Well, he says he behaved intentionally arrogantly,
Wow.
maybe out of some capricious lust of revenge.
Not exactly a mature response.
No, not really. And the women are clearly confused by his behavior.
They probably expected the old Wagner,
Right, the argumentative one who always tried to instruct them.
Yeah.
But he's not doing that anymore.
So what is he doing?
He's just engaging in jokes and friendly chaff.
Huh. So like a complete turnaround.
Yeah, he describes himself as feeling like an uncaged bird.
Okay.
And it's quite revealing about how his social interactions are evolving.
So this trip is kind of a turning point in a way.
It seems like it, yeah.
And what about his friend?
Well, his friend tried to imitate his behavior,
Okay.
but it didn't go over so well.
Too much of a good thing, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah. So, then there's this episode at the Black Horse Hotel in Prague.
What happens there?
Well, it seems like he and his friend were really letting loose.
Okay.
And they get egged on by this timid businessman from Frankfurt on the Oder,
Right.
who apparently wanted to seem daring.
Yeah.
And so they end up having this symposium in the public room of the hotel.
A symposium.
Yeah, and they're bellowing out the Marseillaise.
Wow. A bit provocative.
Yeah, and then it gets even crazier.
How so?
Wagner starts doing these acrobatic feats on the outer ledges of the windows.
What?
Yeah, like really dangerous stuff.
That's pretty reckless.
It is. And he mentions that people who didn't know about his childhood hobby of climbing and acrobatics were horrified.
So this wasn't just a one-time thing for him.
Apparently not. It seems like he had a bit of a daredevil streak.
All right. So we see these different sides of him.
Mm-hmm.
The intense emotional connection to music.
Yeah.
The rebelliousness, the arrogance,
Yeah.
the recklessness.
It's like he's constantly pushing boundaries in different areas of his life.
Right. Testing limits.
Okay, so let's move on to his first visit to Weimar.
All right.
And what's interesting here is that he goes to Goethe's house,
Okay.
but he describes it as a non-emotional visit.
Huh. That's surprising given Goethe's stature.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to have made much of an impression on him at the time.
Interesting.
But then he gets to Rudolstadt,
Okay.
and he's really drawn to the active theater life there.
Even though he wasn't the conductor at that point.
Right, he wasn't in a leadership role.
But he was still drawn to the energy of it.
Yeah, he was involved in rehearsals for all sorts of operas and musical comedies.
So he's getting a lot of practical experience.
Exactly, and he talks about two passions that dominated his 6-week stay in Rudolstadt.
What were they?
One was writing the libretto for his opera, Das Liebesverbot,
Okay.
and the other was his growing attachment to Mina.
So romance is entering the picture.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at the same time, he's sketching a symphony in E major.
All right.
And he mentions that it was influenced by Beethoven's 7th and 8th symphonies.
Okay.
But he's also starting to feel this conviction that producing truly noteworthy symphonic work in Beethoven's style was impossible.
So he's recognizing the shadow of Beethoven,
Yeah, and he's being drawn more and more to opera.
which he calls the most fascinating form of art.
Exactly. And he ends up completing most of the operatic poem for Das Liebesverbot during this time.
Okay.
And he says he put a lot of care into it.
So his focus is shifting.
Definitely. So then we get to Magdeburg, and here's where things get really complicated, both personally and professionally.
How so?
Well, there's this opera by Auber called Les Stock,
Okay.
and Wagner had assured Auber in Paris that the male chorus in Magdeburg had full vocal power.
So he's vouching for them.
Yeah, and he's also working really hard on composing Das Liebesverbot,
Right.
and he wants to have a benefit performance of it.
So he's got a lot riding on this.
Yeah, he's really throwing himself into it.
And how is his relationship with Mina going?
Well, they're spending a lot of time together.
Okay.
But Mina's mother isn't so keen on their relationship.
Classic.
Yeah, and their financial situation is pretty precarious.
Right. Always a concern.
And Mina is ambitious. She wants to see some improvement in their circumstances before they get married.
Makes sense.
But then there's this rivalry that develops at the Magdeburg Theater.
Okay.
And it involves the chief stage manager, who happens to be the husband of Mina's rival.
Oh, so this is getting messy.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, Mina accepts a better offer from the Königstadt Theater in Berlin.
Wow.
And she does this without really considering Wagner's feelings.
So he's devastated.
Completely. He feels abandoned and betrayed.
Ouch.
And he can't stop her from leaving.
So what does he do?
He writes her this passionate letter begging her to come back.
Okay.
And he proposes marriage.
So he's putting it all on the line.
He is. And then things take another turn.
What happened?
His brother-in-law, Wolfram, is also going to the Königstadt Theater.
Okay.
And his sister Clara is worried about Wagner's state of mind.
Gratefully so.
And she shows him a letter that Wolfram had sent from Berlin.
And what does it say?
It describes some scandalous behavior on Mina's part.
Oh, no. So now he's really doubting her.
Yeah, and he abandons his reserve and writes to Wolfram.
Asking for clarification.
Yeah, but Wolfram's reply is surprising.
How so?
He apologizes and admits that he accused Mina too hastily,
Okay.
based on some idle gossip,
Hmm.
and now he believes that she's genuine.
What a turnaround.
I know, and he even hopes that Wagner will marry her.
Wow. So he's gone from condemning her to endorsing the relationship.
Yeah, it's quite a shift. So Wagner writes to Mina, imploring her to return.
Then what does she say?
Well, she's also unhappy in Berlin.
It sounds like she made a mistake.
Yeah, she finds the theater scene there too frivolous.
Okay.
And she wants to come back.
So it works out.
Well, sort of.
What do you mean?
There's a theater committee meeting in Magdeburg,
Okay.
and Wagner passionately defends Mina,
Good for him.
and they end up reinstating her.
Wow. So he really fought for her.
He did, and then he travels to Magdeburg to be with her.
So they're reunited.
They are, and they start to build a life together
Okay.
as he's finishing the score for Das Liebesverbot.
So it's the beginning of 1836.
Right around the new year.
And they're both pinning their hopes on the success of this opera.
Exactly. They're relying on it for their future plans.
But there's some concerns, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The director of the theater is constantly going bankrupt.
Despite having royal support.
I know, it's kind of crazy.
It is.
And Wagner is really hoping that this production will mark a change in his own unsatisfactory circumstances.
Right.
And he wants to use the benefit performance to recoup his travel expenses.
Makes sense.
But there are some delays.
Okay.
The rehearsals get postponed until the end of the season.
Why?
Well, they were hoping to capitalize on the public's favor during the concluding performances.
Okay. So they're trying to be strategic.
Yeah, but then the unexpected happens.
What's that?
The whole season collapses in March
Oh, no, why?
because the salaries haven't been paid and all the popular singers resign.
So what happens to Das Liebesverbot?
Wagner is completely despairing.
He must think it'll never be produced.
Yeah, he's really down about it.
But the singers like him, right?
They do.
So maybe they'll help him out.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens.
Wow, so they're willing to rehearse even though they're not getting paid.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
It is.
But they only have 10 days to rehearse.
10 days.
For a grand opera with all these complex passages.
That's not much time.
No, it's not.
So how do they manage?
Well, Wagner's relying on the singer's extraordinary efforts
Okay.
and his own conducting skills.
He's got to pull out all the stops.
He does, and he's actually quite pleased with the orchestral rehearsals
Why is that?
because he's really good at prompting and directing the musicians.
So the orchestra's sounding good.
Yeah, but there's a problem.
What is it?
They haven't really considered the restrictions of performing in front of a live audience.
Oh, they've only rehearsed in private.
Right.
Okay.
And when the performance actually happens, it's a disaster.
Oh, no. How so?
The singers are uncertain and embarrassed.
Stage fright.
Yeah, and the tenor Freimuller has a terrible memory.
Oh.
He can only sing if he follows his routine.
Oh, no.
And he's relying on this large plume on his helmet to stay oriented.
A plume.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
It is.
And to make matters worse, the printed librettos aren't ready in time.
Oh, so the audience can't follow along.
Exactly, so they're completely confused.
It sounds like a complete mess.
It is. Wagner describes it as a musical shadow play,
Wow.
with the orchestra just producing these inexplicable effusions.
Wow.
And then, to top it all off,
What now?
a bandmaster comes up to Wagner after the performance and
Yeah.
gives him all this unsolicited advice about orchestration.
Oh, no. I bet Wagner didn't want to hear that.
Not really, but he tries to be polite about it.
So what are his final impressions of Magnaberg?
Well, he's leaving with a sense of disappointment.
Yeah. It's not how he hoped things would go.
And he has this recurring feeling that he's never going to return to this place.
Which he often feels when he leaves somewhere where he hoped for success but didn't achieve it.
Right, it's like closing a chapter and knowing that it's over.
Okay, so we've seen Wagner go through all these ups and downs in his early life.
Right.
These intense experiences that are shaping him as a person and as an artist.
Exactly. And now we're going to shift gears quite drastically
Yeah.
and dive into the world of the Law of One. So can you give us some background on this material?
Sure. So the Law of One emerged from a series of channeled sessions
Okay.
that were conducted by a group called LL Research.
LL Research.
Yeah. And the main people involved were Don Elkins, Carla Ruckert, and later Jim McCarty.
Okay. And when did this start?
In January 1981,
Okay.
Don had been involved in UFO research for quite a while,
All right.
and he was interested in finding verifiable evidence of contact with extraterrestrial intelligences.
Okay.
And so he had been investigating seances,
Interesting.
trying to find a believable materialization phenomenon.
So like a physical manifestation.
Exactly. But the contact with Ra happened in a way that they weren't really expecting.
How exciting.
It occurred during a channeling teaching session.
So they weren't specifically trying to contact Ra at that moment?
Not at all. It was a surprise.
And then what happened?
Well, they recognized the significance of this contact,
Okay.
and so they established a dedicated room for these sessions. And something that they emphasized was the importance of the harmonious relationship between Don, Carla, and Jim.
Okay.
That this was crucial for maintaining the contact with Ra.
Interesting. So what are some of the fundamental concepts that are presented in the Law of One?
Well, the core principle is the understanding that all things are one.
Okay.
All beings are ultimately part of the infinite creator.
All right. So there's this underlying unity to everything.
Exactly. And Ra identifies as a social memory complex of sixth density from the Confederation of Planets in service to the infinite creator.
Okay. So break that down for me.
All right. So a social memory complex you can think of as a group consciousness
Okay.
that has a shared understanding and a shared history.
Right.
And sixth density refers to a level of consciousness that is far beyond our current level.
Okay.
And the Confederation is this group of planets and civilizations that are oriented towards service to others.
Okay.
So that they're not coming from a place of self-interest.
Right. They're trying to help.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what else?
Well, Ra states that they came to Earth approximately 11,000 years ago
Okay.
to aid in the development of two planetary cultures.
Right.
But they also acknowledge that their direct intervention was a naive belief
Why is that?
because it violated the principle of free will.
Okay. So they learned from that experience.
Yes.
All right. So what did they try to do?
They attempted to learn about healing what they call mind, body, spirit complex distortions
Okay.
using crystals and specific ratios of time and space.
And they say this led to the construction of the pyramids.
That's what they claim.
Okay, so what about this Law of One?
So the Law of One basically boils down to the understanding that everything is interconnected
Okay.
and that there are three primary distortions of this law:
What, eh?
free will, love, and light.
Okay.
And light is considered the third distortion
Why is that?
because it's the first manifestation of the creator that is visible to the body complex.
Okay.
So it's already a step removed from the original oneness.
Interesting. And they talk about being harvestable. What does that mean?
So harvestable means being ready to move on to the next stage of spiritual evolution.
Okay.
And they say that for an entity to be harvestable to fourth density,
Which is the next level up from our current third density.
Right.
Okay.
They need to consciously realize that they do not understand everything.
So a recognition of one's own limitations.
Exactly.
Interesting. And they talk about densities of consciousness.
Yes.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. So they describe a progression through 7 densities of consciousness.
7.
Yeah.
Okay.
Starting with first density, which is the consciousness of minerals and water,
Okay.
and then moving up through plant and animal life
Right.
to third density, which is where humanity is currently at.
Okay.
And third density is about developing self-awareness,
Right.
which is a necessary step towards fourth density.
And fourth density is characterized by?
Compassion, love, understanding.
Okay.
And then it goes on to fifth, sixth, and seventh density.
What kind of density is like?
The gateway to the allness of the creator.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so it's this whole grand scheme of evolution.
That's right.
And they also talk about these entities called wanderers.
Yes.
What are they?
So wanderers are beings who are often from sixth density,
Okay.
who choose to incarnate into third density to be of service to humanity.
So they're like volunteers.
In a way.
Yes.
But there's a catch, right?
Yeah, they often experience a forgetting of their true origins.
So they don't remember where they came from.
Right?
And they can become targets for this group called the Orion Group.
Exactly.
And who are the Orion Group?
So the Orion Group is oriented towards service to self.
Okay, so the opposite of the Confederation.
Exactly.
And they're trying to...
Well, they want to create a large harvest of negatively oriented entities from Earth.
So they're trying to sway people towards selfishness?
In a way, yes.
And they specifically target wanderers?
Right, because wanderers are seen as a threat to their agenda.
Okay, so we've got this cosmic battle going on.
In a sense, yes.
And what about the Confederation? So the Confederation is sending love and light to those who call for it.
Okay.
But they have to respect the principle of free will.
So they can't just intervene directly.
Right. They have to allow equal time for the Orion Group.
It's like a balancing act.
Yes.
And they talk about Atlantis.
Right.
What happened there?
Well, they say that the Atlanteans misused information,
Okay.
which led to conflict and destruction.
What kind of destruction?
Talk about crystal-based weapons
Wow.
and something that they describe as nuclear bombs.
So it sounds like a pretty advanced civilization.
It does.
Okay, so they also mention this concept of the logos.
Yes.
What is that?
So the logos is like the organizing principle or the consciousness of a system.
Okay.
And they say that our sun is a sublogos of the logos of our major galaxy.
So it's like a smaller expression of the larger consciousness?
Right. And they even say that an individual mind-body-spirit complex can be seen as a sub-sublogos.
Wow, so we're all connected to this larger whole.
Exactly. That's the idea.
And they talk about crystals quite a bit.
Yes.
What's their perspective on crystals?
They describe crystals as having the ability to be charged by a balanced mind-body-spirit complex.
Okay.
And they say that using crystals to interact with intelligent energy requires a mind-body-spirit complex that is at least partially free of distortions.
So it's like the more harmonious you are internally,
Right.
the more effectively you can work with crystals.
Exactly.
And they talk about the higher self.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure. So the higher self is like a future version of yourself
Okay.
that resides in late sixth density.
And what does it do?
Well, it's like a guide and a helper.
Okay.
It assists us in healing, and it can help us to plan our life experiences.
And it has access to all of our past incarnations.
That's right. It's like the totality of our being.
Wow. And they talk about wanderers having difficulty remembering their purpose.
Yeah, it's a common theme.
And they say that experiencing challenges and opportunities in third density can help them to polarize more effectively.
Right, so the difficulties of life can actually be beneficial for their spiritual growth.
Interesting.
And they talk about healing being more than just physical repair.
Yeah.
They see it as an opportunity to realign the energy centers within the body
All right.
or to restore connections between the mind, body, and spirit.
So it's a holistic approach?
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of balance between love and wisdom
Okay.
for the body's natural healing processes to function optimally.
Interesting. And they even suggest that physical ailments experienced before contact might be due to the subconscious mind conserving energy for the channeling process.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
And they mention psychic attack,
Right.
like the Orion group might be trying to interfere.
Possibly.
Okay, so let's talk more about this Orion group.
All right.
They seem to be a major force in this whole cosmic drama.
They are.
So what's their deal?
Well, they're a service to self-oriented collective.
Okay.
That includes entities from systems like the Southern Cross.
And they're trying.
They want to increase their numbers by attracting negatively oriented entities from planets like Earth.
So they're like soul farmers.
In a sense, yes.
And they have a hierarchical structure based on negativity.
Right. So the more negative you are, the higher up you are in the pecking order.
Wow. And they specifically target wanderers?
Yeah, because wanderers have the potential to disrupt their plans.
Okay. And they use all sorts of tactics.
Right. We might try to tempt positive entities away from serving others
Okay.
and towards focusing on their own ego and advancement.
So they're like the dark side of ambition?
Yeah, you could see it that way.
And they have leaders in fifth density
Right.
who are overseeing these processes of trying to detune positive entity, like turning them away from the light.
In a way, yeah.
And then they have these fourth density minions who carry out the direct influence.
Right.
And they even use what they call magical means.
Which is basically ritualistic practices
Okay.
designed to target highly positive groups.
So they're not messing around.
No, they're not.
And Carla, the instrument of the channeling, was particularly vulnerable to these attacks.
Yes,
Really?
because of pre-existing physical conditions.
Right.
Which made her a prime target.
Okay, so they also talk about time, space, and incarnation.
Right.
How do they explain that?
Well, they describe negative time-space as being analogous to a specific vibration of space-time.
Okay.
And they say that an entity that enters negative time-space will next experience the appropriate space-time for incarnation.
Through what they call the form-making body.
Right. So it's like a transition between realms.
Interesting. And they emphasize the importance of rituals.
Yes.
And what they call the magical personality.
Right.
What is that?
So the magical personality is basically a state of being that is conducive to working with these energies.
Okay. Expert speaker.